Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Mark Brannon. I'm the president of the Princeton Adult School, for those of you who don't know me, and welcome to the third in our series of lectures for the course this semester. The medium is the message, communication for the 21st century. For many of you who are repeat students and have been here last semester for the engineering series, you may very well remember listening to our speaker tonight, Ed Felton, who was good enough to talk last semester on a completely different subject, cryptography. And we've asked him back some months ago, and Ed has been willing to come a second time. And we were talking, obviously, about the communications medium. Professor Felton is the professor of computer science and public affairs, and he's the first director of the Center for Information Technology Policy here at Princeton University. As I said, he's the founding director of this group. His research interests have included computer security and privacy, especially relating to media and consumer products, as well as technology law and policy. He was the lead computer science expert witness for the Department of Justice in the large, well-known Microsoft antitrust case, and he's testified in other important lawsuits. He's testified before the Senate Commerce Committee on digital television technology and regulation, and before the House Administration Committee on the electronic voting. Professor Felton attended the California Institute of Technology, graduated with a degree in physics in 1985, spent a couple of years right after that working as a programmer at Caltech on a parallel supercomputer project. Then he became a grad student in computer sciences at the University of Washington, where he received both his MS degree and his PhD degree. His PhD thesis was on developing automated protocols for communications between different processors. That year, he joined us here at Princeton University on the faculty and rapidly rose through various levels of being appointed a full professor in 2003. He was good enough to really find time to talk to us tonight because he's leading an extraordinarily busy life. As many of you may have seen in press releases, on Thursday of last week, the press release was made that Professor Felton will leave on a temporary basis from Princeton University and go to Washington, where he will be working for the U.S. Federal Trade Commission as the agency's very first chief technologist to help guide government policy in an era when technology has a growing influence on business and consumers. As I mentioned, he's going to take a leave of absence for a year, and we do hope to see you back again in the future. Well, that raised a certain problem because the topic that had been chosen some months ago that was to be presented tonight, called mobile communication and privacy, threatened a potential conflict with his new job. And he was very open with me about that and agreed to continue to come here tonight to talk, and has suggested a topic which I honestly think fits even more precisely into the overall theme of media, and the topic will be the 21st century communication between citizens and government. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ed Felton.
Thanks. Thank you. As Mark said, we did have to change the topic of this talk to one that would not require vetting in Washington. But I'm going to talk about something that is still of interest and something that I hope is relevant to the work that I will be doing in government, and that is 21st century communication between citizens and government. New communication technologies are doing a lot to let people connect to each other in new ways, and institutions are working to try to figure out how to use these technologies effectively. And so I want to talk about how government can do that, and some of the work that we've done here in the Center for Information Technology Policy to try to explore that. Okay, so this is the Federal Trade Commission building in Washington. This is where I'll be working starting in January. And the FTC, like many other government agencies, has been working on this question of how to use new technologies to communicate with citizens. They have a website. Just as of recently, they have a Facebook page. You have to have a Facebook page if you are going to be cool. And you can see they announce various things on here about what's going on. And you can comment, you can like the Federal Trade Commission on Facebook. They don't have a dislike button. And you can see one of the announcements here that we're now on Twitter. So indeed, they have a Twitter feed as well. So they can issue whatever press release they feel like issuing in 140 characters or less. And you can follow the Federal Trade Commission on Twitter. You can see as of the other day, when this was on its first day, they had, 12, 13 people following them. But that number, I'm sure, is much larger by now. All right, so if you are an agency of the government and you want to communicate with citizens, you'll be doing all this stuff. You'll be setting up Facebook and Twitter and email, and you'll have some blogs and all of that kind of stuff. I want to talk about how, though, to go a little bit deeper than that in opening up the operations of government to citizens. And the rest of this talk will go in 3 parts. One, looking at each of the branches of government. So let's start with the legislative branch. And the story I want to tell here starts with a Princeton computer science major, Josh Tauberer, who graduated in 2004. And when Josh graduated from Princeton, having studied computer science, he went off to the University of Pennsylvania and became a grad student in the linguistics department there. And Josh was and is very interested in public policy and in the operation of Congress. And Josh, over time, got frustrated with Congress's website, which was not very good. You could go there and you could look and see what were the bills that were currently on the floor of or the bills that had been introduced in Congress and the votes that were taken on them and so on. But it was really a pretty lousy website. So Josh decided that he was going to build a new website for Congress that was better. This is one guy in his apartment in Philadelphia in his spare time. And he did. He built a website for Congress called govtrack.us, which is clearly better than Congress's own website. Congress's own website is this thing called Thomas. And here's a fairly recent view of Thomas, named after Thomas Jefferson. Thomas had lots of design problems. Just to give you a few examples, there was no permanent link or address for an individual bill, which meant there was no way that you could link to a bill on Thomas in a way that people could just click through and see it. No way to link, refer, or index it. Thomas was designed to prevent search engines from actually indexing the content. So you couldn't find something by Google or any other search engine to find what was on there. If you wanted to use the information, you had to click by hand through the site in order to get to the page you want. So if you wanted to refer someone to a page on Thomas, you'd say something like, go to the front page of Thomas and do this search, and then click the third link, and then click the see the bill link, and so on. And then, and only then, could the person actually see the text of the bill. That was no good. All right, so Josh decided he was going to do a better job, and he did. He built GovTrack. So the question is, how did he do this? Because it's really pretty remarkable if you think about it. One guy working in his spare time in Philadelphia was able to do what the Library of Congress and the US Congress were unable to do. How did he do that? What was Josh's secret sauce? Okay, so a bunch of us here got to thinking about this. What is Josh's secret sauce? And a group of us a few years ago, David Robinson, Harlan Yu, Bill Zeller, and I wrote a paper saying what we thought Josh's secret sauce was. And of course, we wanted to know not only what was Josh's secret sauce, but could we bottle it and give some of it to the government? All right, and here's basically what was going on. Here's the thing that Josh figured out and did, which seemed to be his trick. Whoops. Hang on. There we go. So in order to dig into this, we need to talk a little bit about how Thomas worked. So the basic idea is that this box here indicates the government. So inside the government, there was a bunch of raw data. That is the information about what bills existed, what was the text of those bills, which votes had been taken, how each member had voted on those, in those votes, what were the amendments that were offered, and so on. All of this information was inside computer databases that the Congress had somewhere. So Congress then took that raw data and they formatted it into a website. That is, they organized it into paragraphs and they put headings up on the top and they wrote it in a language called HTML that describes the layout of information on a web page. So they took all that information and they embedded it in a bunch of formatting. They kind of baked in the formatting to make the Thomas site, which I show in blue here to indicate that it's actually available to the public. And then they made the Thomas site available to the public. Okay, so up here, Josh's govtrack.us, meaning a computer that Josh has had on his desk in his apartment in Philadelphia. What Josh did is he wrote a program called a screen scraper. That is a computer program he wrote which went to visit the Thomas site, visited every single page of Thomas, downloaded a copy of that, and then analyzed it in order to strip away the formatting, to look at it and say, this part must be the bill number, that part must be the name of the member who introduced it, this part must be the text, here's a paragraph break in the text, and so on, to extract from all that formatting and get back to the raw data, which Josh then put into a database. He then used that raw data to build his own website, GovTrack, which had a whole bunch of features that the original site didn't, including some very basic ones like a better design, the ability to link to a bill, and also features like the ability to follow a particular bill. So you'd get a notification every time there was some action on that bill, when there was a vote or an amendment or anything. Or to follow particular topics, or to follow your member of Congress and get notified whenever your member did something. All these sorts of different kinds of options Josh built into his site. Now, but what Josh did was actually went beyond that, which is that he not only published the GovTrack site, he also published his raw data. That is, he set up a place where anybody could go and get the raw data directly from him and download it themselves. And so what happened? Well, a guy named Jim Harper in Washington set up, as a hobby, a site called WashingtonWatch.com. And what Jim did is, rather than having to go through this terrible process of screen scraping, this laborious process requiring a lot of finicky programming that Josh had done, he just went and got Josh's raw data, downloaded it, made a copy of it, and then it was relatively straightforward for Jim to make his own Washington Watch site. So here's Washington Watch. And Washington Watch, unlike Josh's site, which was all about having ways of following what was happening, Washington Watch came with a little bit of an ideology. Washington Watch was all about how much does this cost. You could go on Washington Watch and see next to each bill a cost estimate. How much did this cost? This bill, here we see sort of in the middle of the screen, H.R. 2774, the Solar Energy Research and Advancement Act of 2007. That would have, if passed, would have cost $2.57 per U.S. family. And so Washington Watch was all about how much does this cost, and let's have a debate here on the site about whether it's worth it. So there's a little bit of ideology. It's a different way of interacting with the things going on in Congress. But the point is that because Josh had released this raw data, Jim Harper, in building Washington Watch, also a guy doing something on the side as a hobby, was able to build his own site much more easily. And it wasn't just Washington Watch. There were other sites, another one called MapLight that came from a group called the Sunlight Foundation. And here's MapLight. MapLight is a different way of looking at what's happening in Congress. This says, okay, here's a bill. Here's information about which interest groups support it and which interest groups oppose it based on donations. You can also on MapLight go and get a timeline that shows actions by different members of Congress on a timeline and the donations to those same members by pro and con groups on the same timeline. You can look at that and judge for yourself. So there's a little bit, this is another view of what's important to understand and look at in what's happening in Congress. And this is what the Sunlight Foundation chose to do. All right, and these, in fact, were not the only two. There are others. I'm not going to go through more examples, but there there was a whole flowering of sites which took different views of what it meant to be a website about the Congress. Some of these, by the way, views that the Congress itself would not take. It's a pretty good guess that Congress's own website is not going to let you visualize donations against votes on the same timeline. But it's important for us as a public to have the ability to do that, so we can reach our own conclusions about what's going on. Okay. So Josh's secret sauce was that he did this work of screen scraping, but then especially that he published the raw data. So this kind of suggests the obvious question: why doesn't Congress themselves publish the raw data? And what the group of the four of us proposed is that, in fact, the approach for government to opening up its data to the public should be to just publish the raw data. Indeed, publish the raw data, and if you don't get around to publishing the Thomas site, that's fine with us. Publish the raw data, let Josh build some site, let the Library of Congress build another site if they want, let Jim Harper build his site, let the Sunlight Foundation build their site. So the advantages of doing this are several. First of all, a bunch of the major steps in the process of making a website for Congress get moved outside the government, and things tend to be more efficient when they're done outside the government. Now, some of that is because of the nature of government as an organization, and some of it is because, for good reasons, there are limits on what government can do. For example, if you're going to have a discussion forum about what's going on, you'll want to have someone to be a moderator of that forum to kind of clear out the junk and the insults and the advertisements for unsavory products that people will just put there because it's a trafficked location. You want someone to remove that junk, right? But if you're the government, removing stuff from a public site raises a First Amendment question, a free speech question. Whereas if it's just, say, Josh in his apartment, there's no First Amendment problem with Josh removing stuff from his forum. If you don't like what he removes, just go to Jim Harper's forum. So there's some things that are inherently hard to do in government. The other thing about this is that as the different nature of these different sites sort of indicates, there is not one right way to make a website about what's happening in Congress. There are different kinds of sites you can make that have different points of view and illustrate different aspects of the process. And rather than somebody deciding what's the one best way to make a website for Congress, why don't we say, let's throw open the data and let 1,000 flowers bloom. Anybody can build their site the way they want it, and each citizen can decide which site they want to go to today. So there's a lot of advantages to doing it this way, and in fact we argued in our paper, which we called Government Data and the Invisible Hand, that in fact this was the right way to go. The government, rather than focusing on building websites to people, should focus on opening up its data and publishing it to everyone. And indeed, this is a principle that has been to a significant extent adopted by the US government and by others. So this is the first piece, and the piece that came out of the legislative branch. Now, the Congress has actually moved in the right direction toward opening the data in the way that, that we had argued and that Josh had been urging as well. Okay, let's move on to part two, the judicial branch. So the judicial branch, the courts, are another part of our government which generate a lot of information. Over the last 20 years or so, the federal courts have generated something like 500 million documents. That is documents generated by the courts or documents filed in documents filed by parties to lawsuits in the federal courts and so on. Lots and lots of documents. And those documents, in a very real way, define what the law is. We have a common law system, and in a common law system, there are significant parts of the law that are developed by the rulings of judges. And so certainly the rulings of judges are important public documents that we as citizens ought to be able to see in order to understand what the law says. But of course, a ruling of a judge doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in the context of all the other filings that have happened in that particular case. Every motion that was filed by the parties and counter motion and so on all forms part of the kind of mosaic that makes up the law. So it's important that we as citizens have access to see all of that. So the federal courts in the US have a system called PACER, which stands for Public Access to Court Electronic Records. It's a system that, it's a website you can go onto, and if you have an account on Pacer, and if you've given them your credit card, you can get online public access to case information for all of the federal courts except for the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has their own site where everything is available for free. Okay, so the courts have taken this step to make this information available, but shades of Thomas, Congress's website, Pacer is not that great. It's not that great from a design standpoint, but there's an important factor here, which is the paywall. Pacer charges 8 cents per page to get access to these documents. And some of these documents are large. There are an awful lot of them. So if you wanted to get the full record from some important case, at 8 cents a page, that'll add up pretty fast. Now, that's better than paying 25 or 50 cents a page, which is what you might have to pay if you went to the courthouse and asked the clerk for a hard copy of all these documents. But still, it's significant. And so here, in fact, is a Pacer receipt. I think I paid this myself a while back. 8 cents a page to get all these documents via Pacer. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is limited capabilities. Just like with Thomas, there's no full text search. You can't search through the documents and say, I want every document that mentions, I want every document that cites a particular case, for example. There's no document authentication, which means that if I download a document from Pacer and I give it to you, you can't be sure that it is authentic. You can't be sure that I didn't mess with it. In an ideal world, the documents would have a mark of authenticity that uses cryptography to allow any third party to verify the authenticity, but we don't have that. The documents are not structured, meaning that often the document is just an image of pages, and it doesn't give you information about like who are the names of the parties of the cases and what's the name of the case and so on. Not that easy to find, an unintuitive user interface, so not so good. Also, there are privacy concerns. This is actually a big deal. People in court argue about all kinds of stuff that is private or that they consider private or that they would rather people not know about. So there's lots of information actually in these court records. Social security numbers, taxpayer identification numbers, financial account numbers. Imagine a bankruptcy case. The documents for a bankruptcy case are filled with financial information about not only the party who's going bankrupt, but also often the creditors. So if a business is going bankrupt, the employees are all creditors. You might have the social security numbers of every employee in that document. Information about children, names of minor children, and so on. All that's available at 8 cents a page today. Now, there are rules that say that this stuff is not supposed to be in the documents, that say that the parties who are going to file the documents, whether they're the lawyers or the court itself, are supposed to redact this sensitive information. That is, have a full version of the document that goes only to the parties in the court, and then the public version has that stuff blacked out or redacted. And they actually do that most of the time. But that's not really good enough. So that's a problem with Pacer as well. Okay, so there's a bunch of problems with Pacer, and a group of us here set out to try to do something about it. The first thought is, well, let's convince the courts to do it better. Well, you run into the state of the law. The E-Government Act of 2002, which was passed, this became law in 2002 after being passed by Congress, said that Congress was not going to provide money to the courts to run this public access system. Instead, the Judicial Conference, the body of the judiciary that runs this, should charge fees for electronic access, but only to the extent necessary to run the system. And they said they intend to encourage the Judicial Conference to move to a fee structure in which the information is freely available to the greatest extent possible. All right. Well, it turns out it doesn't really cost 8 cents a page to provide this information, but the courts have gotten used to having this 8 cents a page revenue, and frankly, they could not run their information technology operations without it. That's not such a great deal, but that's where we are. Okay, so a group of us here decided we wanted to do something about this. We couldn't get the law changed, but we decided that we were going to engage in some more direct technological action. We started with the observation that these documents that you're paying 8 cents a page for are public records. They're not subject to copyright limitations, so once you've paid the 8 cents a page, you are free to redistribute that to anyone you want. There's no reason, in principle, for more than one person to buy a particular document. So what we did is we built a technology to facilitate the sharing of these documents, something called ReCap. That's Pacer spelled backwards. Which is, initially was a plugin for the Firefox web browser that helps Pacer users share public court documents that they purchase. So the idea is pretty simple. You download this thing, and it wedges itself as part of your web browser. Then, whenever you buy a document from Pacer, our software will notice that and upload the document to a shared public repository. So if you download a document, you'll get something like this, ReCap file upload. The PDF file that you bought was uploaded to the public archive. The public archive is donated, is hosted by a group called the Internet Archive that is a giant nonprofit repository for all kinds of public information that is of interest to the public. So when you view a docket, that is a list of documents in a case within Pacer, you get this little pop-up box that tells you that ReCap uploaded the docket to the public archive. When you buy a file, that file gets uploaded to the public archive. All this stuff shows up in the public archive. We then take this information, and just like Josh Chauberer did, we kind of rip it apart and reformat it, and we republish it in a format that looks actually kind of like this, which is a structured format that makes it really easy for other people's computer programs to understand what these documents are and what's in the docket. And you can pull this apart if you want, but you can see things. The case name is Hamad versus Bush et al. It's a case number, date filed, last filing, document ID, and so on, all of this. Okay, so not only does ReCap upload these files to the public archive, but if you have ReCap in place and you are browsing on Pacer and Pacer offers to sell you a document, we will helpfully tell you we have that for free. Come and get it. So you see right here, here's the page that Pacer gives you offering to sell you this document if you click on the 2, but next to it there's this little happy R. You click on that, you get this. This document's available for free. Click here to download. And that's the quid pro quo. We will, if you offer us everything that you buy, we will give to you everything that all of our other members have bought. And this automates the process of people sharing these documents. All right. So we beta released this in August of 2009. It's since had a final release. Our repository now has somewhere over 2 million documents, and it's growing. So we have a lot of documents. That's a tiny fraction of all of the court cases from, say, the last 20 years that are available in Pacer. But nonetheless, we have reasonably good coverage of the cases that people most often want to see. If you want to see some of the higher profile cases, Guantanamo cases, the California gay marriage case, the bankruptcy case of the couple from Real Housewives of New Jersey, all the things the public really wants to know about, we have good coverage of. And we have a bunch of partners who were collecting their own sets of documents, justia.com and publicresource.org. Yeah, you'd like this, right? This is the great seal of approval. That is the official corporate seal of a group called Public Resource. The guy who runs it, Carl Malamud, has a bit of a sense of humor. And we've partnered with all of those folks, giving them what we have, and they give us what they have. And we're, over time, trying to build up this kind of public library of court documents, both to make these things available to the public, but also as a way of encouraging the courts to try to follow suit. We got lots of positive media response from this. Probably my favorite is the Wall Street Journal, a sleek little add-on with this stylish and subversive touch. Wired just called it a pretty good hack. We also have gotten actually a lot of appreciation from public interest law groups who often operate all across the ideological spectrum, who often operate on a tight budget and find themselves rationing their access to the documents that they would need to really represent their clients. All right, so where does this take us next? We hope that the courts will open their records. We hope we've demonstrated, or are demonstrating, that it's possible to provide these records in an open way at a relatively low cost. It doesn't cost a huge amount of money to do this. And it actually reduces the load on the courts for people to come to us and get this rather than to go to the courts. We've shown that the records can be provided cheaply and reliably in an open format. The privacy issue is a real one and something that we are currently working on. One of the benefits of getting this big corpus of 2 million plus documents is that we can now actually do research about what's in these documents in a way that we couldn't before. And so, for example, we're working on techniques for automatically identifying private information in these documents and automatically scrubbing it out. That is sometimes easy. It's easy to automatically recognize the social security number, right? It's digit, 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 dash, digit, digit, dash, digit, 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 digit. Easy pattern to look for. But what about recognizing the name of a child? Names of children are supposed to be redacted. Names of adults are supposed to be left in. It's not so easy with some sort of computer program to recognize the difference. So we're working on these sorts of problems, try to get a picture of whether we can remove private information automatically from these documents. Having these 2 million documents to work with lets us actually test out different methods and see how well they work. And we're working to make this data as accessible and useful to other researchers as well. All right, so that is the judicial branch. Let's move on to the executive branch. The executive branch is in many ways the most interesting one. It's certainly the most complicated branch of government and the one that has the most people working for it. It also faces the most varied set of challenges in interacting with the public. Now, when the Obama administration came into office, they had very high hopes of using technology to connect to the public in new ways. During the campaign, the Obama campaign had, actually both campaigns had to an unprecedented extent used social media and new media to connect with the public. The McCain campaign did so more than any other presidential campaign ever had. It's just that the Obama campaign was so far beyond even them in that area. So when the Obama administration came in, they had high hopes. We're going to take what we were doing during the campaign and we're going to do it while we're running the government. Well, it turned out that was a little bit harder than they thought. They've had all kinds of challenges in doing that, and they've made progress, but still haven't gotten there. So let me give you one example. Early on, they decided to have a virtual online town hall. So here's the idea, that they would open up this website, and and citizens could go to the website, and you could suggest questions to ask the president. And you could vote on which questions should be asked to the president. And then the president would go on a live video cast, and he would answer the questions that were the most popular, got the most votes in different subject areas. So that seems like a good idea, and they got a technology for submitting and voting on the questions called Google Moderator, which came from Google, which had been designed for allowing audiences at conferences to ask questions of the speaker. If you have a very large audience, rather than raising your hand and so on, the idea is you'd have a website, and at a Google conference, everyone has their laptop open or their iPad in front of them, and they could just go online and vote for questions, and the speaker would answer the top questions. It works pretty well in that setting. So the White House did the same thing. They got Google Moderator, and people could go and they could vote on which questions. And well, it didn't turn out quite the way they expected. So what happened is that a group of people who were really interested in pushing for legalization of marijuana decided to organize themselves, and they went here. And what ended up happening is that the top-rated question in virtually every category had to do with marijuana legalization. On the topic of the economy and jobs, it was, won't marijuana legalization create jobs? On the topic of health care, it was about medical marijuana. Now, this I would assert, did not really represent the views of the American people as to what were the most important issues facing the president, but this process had been captured by a group that showed up in numbers and voted in a coherent way. So they didn't get quite what they wanted. And indeed, this is one of the problems you have when you try to take the kinds of social technologies that work at a smaller scale and scale them up to a national level, not only to having that many users using it, but to be using it in a situation where the stakes are perhaps higher than they are in some other settings. and technologies that would work in a smaller scale and with lower stakes stop working. So I want to talk about a little bit of work that's been going on here that we hope will do a better job of being able to sort through this kind of input from the public. And the story starts really with a microcosm, a microcosm of the federal government, namely the Princeton University undergraduate student government. A couple of years ago, the undergraduate student government had the idea that they wanted to do something like this. They wanted to get input from students about which things the USG should be doing. What should be the, and this guy, Josh Weinstein, came in as the new USG president. He said, we're going to go online, we're going to get information about what students want us to do. And we're going to have some kind of online voting. I'm not sure how it's going to work, but I'm a sociology student, and I'm going to talk to my advisor, Matt Selgonic, and we're going to figure out how to do it. Okay. And so they started with an idea that was based on a website that maybe some of you have seen called Kitten Wars. Here's the idea of Kitten Wars. You go to this site, and it shows you two pictures of kittens. Here's Smokey the Fifth and Madison. And you have to decide which one is cuter. And you click on whichever kitten is cuter. Then it shows you two more kittens. You decide which one is cuter. You click on it again. An hour later, you're still clicking. This is unbelievably sticky. You can then go and you can look. You can see up here on the left, there's different things you can look at. Which are the winningest kittens? And man, are they cute. The losingest kittens, and they're as ugly as you might imagine. There also are places you can look to see the most controversial kittens, the kittens that generate the most division of opinion as to whether they're cute or not. Lots of information. So why is this sticky? Well, it's sticky partly because it's kittens. And you can't make government as cute as kittens. But it's also sticky for other reasons. It's fast. You get sort of instant gratification. The question you're asked is simple, this or that. And it's kind of like a game. So what Matt Selgonic and working with Nadia Henninger, a computer science grad student, realized is that you could take this idea of Kitten Wars and you could apply it to a lot of settings. We're going to show you pairs of items to compare, and we're going to get your comparison, and then we're going to get you to do it again and try to make a site that's as sticky as possible. But what they also realized is that you could go beyond the sort of simple winningest and losingest kind of analysis to do a much more sophisticated kind of, much more sophisticated and systematic analysis of the results that you get to get more information out than just a kind of winning percentage. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. Right, so what they made is this site for the undergraduate student government, which let students go and log on, and it would say, what do you want more? Do you want breakfast on the weekends, or do you want more video games in the campus club? And you click on, the student would click on which one they wanted, and then they'd get another pair. Or, and critically, you could go and add your own suggestion. And if you put your own suggestion in, that would go into the mix, and it would get compared against things. So the undergraduate student government started out, they seeded this with some number, I think something like 100 things that they thought would be important to the student body, and they started it going. And they got a really quite striking response. This shows the response in terms of the number of votes cast over the first hours that the thing was open. This is the first 34 hours. And you see you get up to something like 23,000 votes cast by the roughly 5,000 Princeton undergraduates, based just on a single email message sent out to the student body. So they got a lot of votes from a lot of people over a relatively short period of time. And a bunch of interesting things happened. First of all, they got a lot of submissions of new ideas. And what they found were several things. First of all, they found that many of the ideas that were rated the best were ones that had come from students and not from the undergraduate student government, meaning that these things were not in the list of the top 100 initiatives that the USG thought they should be doing. More than half of the top 10 were submitted by students. That's number one. Number two, they found that their own ideas about which of their own submissions would be important turned out not to be right. They learned that everything having to do with food tended to get rated near the top. And everything having to do with the USG having more meetings or being more accessible or and so on to students, near the bottom. As long as they delivered food, the students would be pretty happy with them. Although it wasn't all food at the top. The other thing they realized, only really over time, is that this was incredibly valuable to them when they went and talked to the university administration. They'd go to the administration, they'd say the students want X. And the administration, as they had always done, would say, well, okay, but how do you know the students really want X? How do we know that, how do you know that that's right? How do we know? How should we know that students really want it? Well, here they had data. Okay, so this idea from the undergraduate student government, Matt and Nadia and others decided to generalize, and they created a site called allOurIdeas.org, which is now up on the net. And the idea is to let anyone set up one of these idea marketplaces. You go to All Our Ideas, you say, my group wants to do this, you get your own site, you can put in your own ideas to sort of seed the process. You can say whether you want to let your members upload new ones, and then you send out the URL and off you go. Here's one that was run by the OECD, an international organization. Which is the more important action we need to take in education today? The OECD recently had a World Education Summit, and they used this in advance of it to get ideas from their members all around the world, and you could access this in different languages. So here are two of the suggestions. You see that there's something like 27,000 votes at the time that this screenshot was taken, and you can add your own. These came from all over the world. This is kind of faded out, but it's a world map that shows where the votes came from. And you can see there, a lot of them are in North America and Europe, but they really do come from a lot of places in the world. Here's another one. This is run by the City of New York. They have a project called Plan NYC, which is designed to do kind of urban planning. Which do you think is a better idea for creating a greener, greater New York City? And again, you can come up with different suggestions. The New York City Parks Department is doing this, and a bunch of organizations all around the world have done this. Catholic Relief Services used it in several different languages to get ideas from their offices around the world about how to organize things. Some congressional candidates, including Scott Siprel here, in our district use this to get information about about what he should do had he been elected. And what I think is exciting about this is not only that it's a different approach to getting information and one that seems to be sticky and gets people to give you information, but that it actually gives you more information than just kind of what is the winning percentage. You can ask questions like, which ideas tend to go together so that people who like this one also like that one. You can ask questions like, well, what's the sort of main thrust of public opinion, but what is the, but leaving that aside, what is another point of view that a minority of people have? You can kind of do things like segment your users into groups, some of whom tend to feel like this and others of whom tend to feel like that. So you can get more information than you might get from other kinds of voting approaches. And it turns out there's a whole bunch of really technically deep and interesting to me as a researcher questions about how to get the most value out of a site like this. Questions like, how do you analyze the information to get more out of it? How do you decide what question to ask the person next to get the most useful information about public opinion from the next question? And so on. So this is a project that's ongoing. We have a lot of users, and just as important, the site is becoming a research tool in itself, as we can vary the way that it operates, and we can use the data that is gathered from it in order to understand the way opinion breaks down, and in order to understand things about such as how different variations in how you run the site affect the quality of the incoherence of the opinions you get, and so on. Okay. So there is a lot going on in this area. Government at all levels is really seeking ways to connect to their citizens, to get information out by publishing information in public ways, and finding ways to be a catalyst for private parties to take that information and distribute it further. government is also struggling to find ways of getting information in. The technologies like the internet provide a way for many more citizens to send information to government, to provide suggestions, to respond to government's questions and requests for comments. And the need to capture all of that in an effective way and to analyze it and to make the most of it raises a bunch of really interesting technical questions. I think going forward, we're going to continue to see a lot of developments in this area. We're going to see people in private industry doing more and more to build products around the use of these data sets. We're going to see changes in the way government operates as well. In recent years, for example, the federal government has started to publish information about all of the spending and where the money goes, how it's spent, and so on. There is a push right now to try to get the new Congress to set up a public database of all of the earmarks that are done, so that information is available. Who asked for it? Where does it go? And so on. That's something that's technically possible. And there's a group of people, including some of the folks who I mentioned in the talk, who are trying to push to make that happen. And I think there's a very real chance that that kind of thing can happen. And the availability of that kind of database to citizens in real time can change the way that we interact with our government. It requires pressure because there is a lot of pushback from people who would prefer that things be done in the old-fashioned way, where there are barriers to information flow. Information is power, and whoever controls the flow of that information has some power. But we as citizens need to push to try to get the information flowing and to try to break down that barrier between what the government is doing and what we're seeing. I think there's a lot of exciting things going on in that area, and I've been really encouraged by what I've seen working both as a researcher and system builder, but also working with people in government. And I'm especially excited now that I myself am going to government and hope to play a part in this issue from the other side. Thanks. Sure. Questions? Back here.
What do you think is going to happen about online voting for elections? How do we get there?
Online voting, like voting from your PC or your phone?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we have a long way to go before that becomes safe. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. One of the fundamental reasons is that we are really unable to secure desktop computers very well. Estimates vary, but probably something like 5 to 10% of all desktop computers are infected with some kind of malicious software. And in elections that are closer than that, you really worry about letting people vote using their computers. There has been a push toward internet voting, especially for overseas voters. And probably the most challenging case here, the people who have the hardest time with the logistics of voting, are overseas military. Right? So imagine some soldier in some small village in Afghanistan. It's not, obviously they can't come here to vote, and even voting by mail is logistically pretty hard. And so there are efforts being made to try to give them some way of voting at a distance. And the first stage of that is, which I think ought to be uncontroversial, is to let them get blank absentee ballots by downloading them and then printing them out. The part that's much riskier is to have them submit their completed ballots electronically. The District of Columbia just recently ran a pilot test of this. They had a system which they were hoping to use in the November election, the just recent November election, for online voting for overseas absentee voters. But they did something smart, which is in October, in early October, they ran a public test where they set up a version of the system and they invited the public to try to break into it. To make a long story short, a group from the University of Michigan, Alex Halderman, who's one of our alumni from here, and his graduate students were able to break into this and take this system over completely. Within a few hours, after you cast a vote in the system, it would play the University of Michigan fight song for you. But even more so, they had the system set up so that it would transmit back to them what ballot you had submitted along with your name. It would then substitute a ballot that they had constructed for yours. Yeah, so they had complete control over what was happening in this system. And not only that, but they also managed to get control of the, even of the surveillance cameras in the machine room. So that they could watch the election workers working in the data center in real time. And as well as controlling the network routers that controlled the network in the data center. They controlled what was going on there as completely as it's possible really to control somebody else's system. And it really was a very thorough demonstration that these systems are vulnerable against against a dedicated attacker. So I think we're not there yet. We're struggling even to get in-person voting as secure as it could be. That's a whole other lecture. Yes.
Can you say a further word about this attempt to take over, and what can you do to prevent takeovers as just illustrated here and earlier in the talk?
Sort of taking over of a hostile takeover of a computer system. Sure. Let's see. So the basic problem is that all the software programs that are on your computer have the ability to do whatever it is that they want to do. So if you get a program from someone who is trustworthy and install it on your system, then it will do only what it's supposed to do, whatever that is. Let's let you listen to music or whatever. But if somebody who is hostile to you is able to put software onto your computer, then it can do pretty much anything the computer can do. It's as if you've lost control of this device that is in that you have. And this device, for example, this is my laptop, is actually could be pretty dangerous to my interests if someone else were to get control of it. So, for example, it has a microphone on it. It has a camera on it, which can be all those can be turned on and off by software that's on here. It has a connection to the network, which would let it send information that is gathered out to somewhere else. I have access on this to all of my email, which includes most of my business communications, access to some information about personal finances and health and so on. So tons of information available. And the problem is that the defenses that are in place to protect these systems are extremely complicated and engineered pretty well, but not really well enough to provide a very strong defense. Now the odds are in your favor in the sense that it's not certain that someone will try to take over your computer, but it's a very real possibility. So this is a matter of great concern. It's a matter of great concern from a public policy standpoint. There are people, I guarantee you there are people in Washington who lose sleep over this issue. There's talk about a cyber Pearl Harbor and so on. I think that's overblown. But there is a very real concern about the stability of computer systems. And the technical defenses are really not quite there. Now, right, that sounds pretty scary, right? But I think it's not. But I think it's important to keep this in context. There are lots of terrible things that could happen to us every day that we don't really have defenses against, right? I mean, when I leave here and walk down the street, someone could clunk me on the head with a brick and take my wallet. And I don't really have a defense against that, right? I don't have some kind of hard hat or impermeable hairdo that will stop someone from hitting my head, and my wallet isn't welded to my body, and so on. We have a whole set of mechanisms that operate to protect us against these sorts of crimes, starting with the way that we raise our children to, and teach them that you don't want to be the kind of person who does that stuff, up to law enforcement and the way that people look out for each other and will come to each other's aid if there's a problem. So there are a lot of defenses that may be in place, but what we don't have is a technological wall that by itself will protect us. I hope that's sort of an answer. That's the best one I can give, I'm afraid. Yes.
website. Is that something that a local organization
It's open to the public. It's free.
can create themselves?
Yes.
And what is the downside? Is there a downside?
Is there a downside? Well, you might waste some.
Worried about it.
Let's see. You might waste some time. The if you go and set up the a site in the most simple, straightforward way, it will be public, so people might be able to see what choices your members have uploaded. There are things that can be done about that. So there is some risk that some outsider will see what's going on within your organization. A lot of organizations don't care about that, or they're willing to go to the trouble to find a way to password protect it and so on. But really, it's designed to be open and available to anybody who wants to use it. There's no barrier. You don't have to pay. You do need to set up an account so that you can come and see the statistics afterward yourself, but not more than that. Yes.
With all this voting, is there a danger of a tyranny of the majority, where it may become more difficult to do unpopular things?
Well, let's see. So, obviously, a tyranny of the majority is always an issue whenever you're voting on anything. The kind of voting that I'm talking about here is, its mission is to tell, in this government or the leadership of an organization, what the members think. And it is important to be able to get more than just to be able to extract more information than just what is the most popular thing. And so with some of these systems, including All Our Ideas, there is, at least in principle, a way to get more information. You can say, well, 2/3 of the people feel this way, but there's a vocal minority, there's a minority of 1/3 who feel this other way, and then there's 5% who feel this way. And so you can get the information about what the spectrum of opinion is and how many people fall into each of the categories or groups. Now, what a government or the leaders of a local organization do with that is sort of up to them. If you're talking about something like national or state government, there are protections built in, obviously, for minorities, so that the majority can't do absolutely everything they want. And you have to hope that those will operate here. But ultimately, this is a tool for measurement, and we can't do more than summarize what information is. We can't do more than summarize what the opinion is.
Well, one of the things that I find the increasing ability for statistics to continuously come to politicians regarding what these people say has, I believe, created a very kind of a slow pace by which things get done. It's constantly wondering what the public wants.
Yeah.
When we elect someone to be there. And we elect them because we believe they would know more than we do. We expect them to know more than we do. For them to constantly come back to us and ask us what our opinions are,
Yeah.
seems to be the wrong direction. I would think that I would want the politician to know a lot more than that. And I want him to be.
Well, it would be good. It would be good to have people in leadership who are smarter than us. Nothing personal, but I apply that to myself too.
The whole concept. We're not a democracy. We're a republic.
Well, so there are, I think, though, cases where it is genuinely valuable for leaders to learn something about the public. So, for example, we might say that we want leaders to be good technicians of government, that they should know how to make the things happen that should happen. But in some cases, you really have a question about values, about which of two useful things is better to have. We can have this or we can have that. And we know how, as a matter of governing technique, to get this if that's what we want, or to get that if that's what we want. But in a situation like that, it may be appropriate to say which thing is more important to the public to have. And that's, And a politician, a great politician will just intuitively know what the public is likely to want. But at some level, if it's really a decision about values, which of these two good things do we want, because we can't have both, then I would argue that public opinion is a good way to determine which one you want. Now, it's true that that distinction is often lost. And we see a lot of political debate, which is people commenting on the sort of inside technical aspects of government who don't see, who know less about how those things work. People giving advice about, say, parliamentary strategy in the Senate, as an example. Maybe not the best thing to go to the public for advice about. Questions about what the Senate should be trying to achieve, though, I think are appropriate for the public.
How do you put them in the same process systems like that if you have the online vote?
Mm-hmm.
Where somebody just either by hacking into it or the problem that Obama had with the questions in there, where a group by organizing takes control of the problem.
Sure. Well, there's different ways that things could go wrong, right? One is that somebody actually takes over the site and they just stuff the database or they just erase the votes that people have already cast or something like that. And that's a matter of that's a matter of trying to secure the site. One would hope at least that the stakes are lower, that if you get a result that is wrong, obviously wrong, if something goes wrong, that it's not as severe as if someone actually does tamper with an actual election for who's going to be, say, the next senator from New Jersey. But as to how you deal with organized groups who show up and actually do cast votes, you can't stop that, but you can, I think, detect it. And this is one of the benefits of going beyond just kind of tallying, to be able to get information about the different sort of opinion groups. You can say, look, 80% of the votes that were cast by this group of people who care about this particular set of things, marijuana legalization, say. But among the other 20%, here's where the opinion was. Right? And that lets a person who is reading this information put their own interpretation on it and say, well, this looks like a group that showed up disproportionately. But the rest of this looks like, which you can separate analytically, looks like something which is more like the opinion that we were trying to measure. So again, you can't stop it, but the hope is that you can detect it and sort of factor it out of your analysis if you want to. Yes?
I'm sort of intrigued by the idea of protecting the information that's on your laptop and privacy, and then the fact that Recap would call it pretty good hack by wire,
Yes.
which means I'm trying to get that information from you and pull it in because the citizens need to know that.
Mm-hmm.
So are we just changing our definition of hacking?
Well, let's see. So the word hack is complicated. It, in many technical circles, is a compliment because it doesn't have the connotation of illegality. In fact, originally the term hack was just used to refer to some clever technical achievement. And it was only later that people who do clever but illegal things adopted the term, and the press has kind of picked it up. So I understood wired to mean this in the positive sense. So certainly, in the case of Recap, we were very careful to make sure that what we were doing was entirely legal, first of all. But second, we thought pretty hard about the ethical implications of doing it, which before we did it. And we worked hard to be very transparent with everybody about what we were doing and why. Rather than being sneaky about it, we made sure that the courts understood what we were doing and why. We gave them an opportunity to give us feedback and say that, would you please do it this other way if they had a reason to do so. We made sure that our users understood what information would get uploaded when. Doing this in a transparent way actually is very important. Yeah,
I don't want that choice. It's not the right.
sure.
What's your experience with using, you're looking at two things, but you know that you're offering a choice of political applications when you some choices.
People might object. I mean, just as a matter of the design of the system, they're allowed to reject a comparison and say, I don't want to answer that. Certainly, it's a problem that if you're letting people make their own suggestions, they can suggest things that are impossible. Right? And as you suggested, one of the big problems in our politics today is that people want to have at the same time things that can't all be had at the same time. And you know, we can't, by building a technology like this, force people to face those choices. That has to be the job for somebody else. But it's true, we're not, you know, that's a problem we can't solve. We can't solve this way.
My question is about your new job.
Yes.
What is the Federal Trade Commission, and why do they need a chief technologist?
Sure.
And why did you choose to go there?
Okay, great. So the Federal Trade Commission is, their basic mission is consumer protection. So, so what does that mean? That means that they do a bunch of things. They do enforcement against deceptive and unfair business practices. What this means in practice is various kinds of scams and starting with very simple things like companies systematically not honoring their warranties, or lying to consumers about the dangers of their products, and so on. So that's number one, is deceptive and unfair business practices. The second thing that they do is, and there's a lot of that kind of stuff that goes on online, right? The second thing they do is competition or antitrust. The FTC has half of the antitrust enforcement responsibility in the US government. The other half is in the Department of Justice. And so that involves both dealing with certain kinds of monopoly behavior as well as vetting mergers or acquisitions between large companies in the same market. And the third thing that the FTC does is there's a set of specific responsibilities that they've been given by Congress. They run the Do Not Call list. They run the free annual credit report program. They do certain enforcement of the CAN-SPAM Act, which is a law against email spam. And they enforce the certain public notification parts of the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which is about banking practices and so on. So a lot of what they do, a lot of what the FTC does relates to technology more and more. One of the areas that is very big for them right now is online privacy. And this is one of the, I think, is likely to be one of the main areas that, that I'll be working in. They've been doing a big long study and analysis of privacy and are preparing to issue a report on the result of that relatively soon. I'm likely to work also on issues related to computer security, cybersecurity, as they relate to consumer protection. That is, there are a lot of people in government who are working on cybersecurity from the standpoint of how do you protect the sort of big critical systems, the banking servers and critical government systems and so on. But the FTC, being a consumer protection agency, is really really looks at that issue from the standpoint of how do you protect the interests of the average user, both against bad things that happen on your own computer, but also against bad things that might happen to your data as a result of a break-in at some company. So those are examples of the sorts of things that go on. Really a lot, because so much of what happens in trade and business these days involves the internet and computer technology. Really a lot of the things that they do relate to technology. And part of my job is to be a sort of general purpose technical advisor to the chairman of the FTC and the organization as a whole. So why did I'll be the first person in this position. And the reason the position was created really is that they recognized that they wanted to sort of beef up their level of technical knowledge. They wanted to build up a core of people within the agency who are professional technologists. And so my role is to help all of that happen. And so why am I doing it? The last part of your question. Really, I've been studying these issues here at the university, first as a computer scientist, just from a technical standpoint, but then later also the public policy aspects of it. And I've been teaching about public policy, how these decisions are made, how things happen, how they could happen better, and so on within government. And this is a chance to actually practice this and see what this looks like from the other side of the street. So I'm going to go and do it for a while and learn how it works, and then come back and teach students how it really works. That's the plan. I guess we're done.